Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady. I'm the online media manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Software Requirements, 7 Critical Success Factors. Today's featured speakers are Carl Wiegers and Franklin Carr, and the webinar will last approximately 60 minutes including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to iRise Software for sponsoring this event, and at this time I'll turn it over to Carl to get us started.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome to everyone to today's presentation of 7 critical success factors for software requirements. My name is Franklin Carr, and I'm a senior manager with the event sponsor iRise. Successful software development depends on effective communications across diverse sets of teams and members and stakeholders. Too many teams still rely on static documents, diagrams, and click-through prototypes. But for today's rich, interactive applications, these deliverables just aren't enough. For over a decade, iRise has been helping businesses around the world solve issues with application definition and requirements elicitation. Our customers use our innovative, patented drag-and-drop solution to create realistic simulations of web, desktop, and mobile applications. iRise simulations allow stakeholders to see, interact, and even test the proposed solution before a single line of code is written. In addition to our simulation capabilities, our interactive and collaborative platform will integrate with other solutions you may already use to drive your SDLC, such as a requirements management tool, QA, and testing platforms. iRise will also give you the ability to generate user interface code directly from the simulation. So in other words, iRise can effectively guide your team from concept to launch. So now, in conjunction with Modern Analyst, I'm pleased to introduce today's featured speaker, Carl Wiegers.
Thank you, Franklin, and thanks to iRise for sponsoring this webinar. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Here's a little information about me. There's my smiling face. And you can see some of the books I've written here. The one on the right is kind of interesting, a memoir of life lessons called Pearls from Sand, How Small Encounters Lead to Powerful Lessons. Rather different from my technical books, but a lot of fun to write. You might also find the consulting tips and tricks blog listed at the bottom of the page there interesting. Even if you're not an independent consultant, there's a lot of information there about things like giving presentations and writing and all those other sorts of things that people have to do from time to time. Now, speaking of books, I am delighted to announce that the 3rd edition of my software requirements book will be published in just a couple of months. On this edition, I worked with a co-author for the first time, Joy Beatty of the requirements consulting company C-Level. And I'm really excited about this book. It's got a lot of enhancements over the 2nd edition with a great deal of additional material and a lot of updates. We have added a lot more information on elicitation, on quality attributes, business requirements, the increasingly important role of the BA, and also a lot on writing high-quality requirements. We've added several new chapters, one on data requirements, another on reuse, and a chapter on issues with agile projects and how requirements fit in. And in fact, we've added sections on applying these requirements practices on the agile projects to many of the chapters. And then we added a whole new family of chapters on requirements for various sorts of project classes, enhancement and replacement projects, outsourced projects, packaged solutions, embedded and other real-time systems, business process automation, and business analytics. So I'm real excited about this book, and it's going to be published on August 22nd, and it's actually available for pre-ordering now from the usual sources like Amazon.com and O'Reilly.com. I guess if I was really plugging this book, I would say it is the 8th critical success factor but software requirements, but I probably shouldn't say that. So let's get started with the 7 critical success factors. And I think it's important to note that these apply no matter what type of project you're working on or what development life cycle you're following. These are equally applicable to classic waterfall or other types of traditional life cycles, as well as to agile projects. And the first thing people have to really establish in order to be successful with requirements is a shared understanding of what requirements are and why they're important, why people care about them. Well, the first problem we run into around requirements is simply one of terminology. People use a lot of different terms to represent the same kinds of information and vice versa. I could show all of you the same single requirement statement, and you'll call it a lot of different things. Some of you might say, well, that's a functional requirement. Someone else says, no, it's a software requirement, or a user requirement, or a user story, or business requirement. It could be a feature or a constraint. Maybe it's a system requirement or perhaps a solution requirement. And we're all looking at the same thing. But the problem we run into is that people have very different ideas of what these terms mean, of what the different kinds of requirements that we encounter on a project are. So that leads to all sorts of confusion and headaches that just makes life harder for us than it needs to be. One of the things that we wonder about is what kind of information it is. Sometimes people will call me up with questions about various random things, and I might get an email or someone says, well, we're talking about business requirements on our project, and we have the following question. And the first thing I have to ask is, well, wait a minute. When you say business requirement, what kind of information do you think that represents? Because your definition of business requirement might not be the same as my definition. I'm not saying my definition is right. I'm saying we just have to agree on the terms we're going to use for these different kinds of requirements knowledge that are critical to project success. We also need to know, where do we get this information and who's responsible for it? Is this something that the business analyst is going to concoct somehow? Is it something we get from users? Is it a piece of information that we have to go to the project sponsor or the marketing manager to figure out? Is it something the developer is going to understand? For example, internal quality attributes for a system, things like maintainability. I don't expect users to tell me about that. I expect developers to help me understand that sort of thing. So without understanding just what we mean by the word requirements and putting adjectives in front of the word requirements, we have all these sorts of confusion. We also then wonder, where should I put this piece of information? If you don't have an established set of document templates or a requirements management tool with well-defined types of requirements, then you might not be sure where to put each piece of information you encounter in a consistent fashion so that all of the readers who need that information to do their job know where to find it. And we also have to ask ourselves as business analysts, when we've got a piece of requirements knowledge, what are we going to do with this? It's a good idea to understand who the audience is for each piece of information that you record about requirements. And if you look at this piece of information in your hand, and if you can't think of how someone might use that, if you look at that and say, well, okay, well, what would the reader do with this? Then you should wonder whether you really need that. You don't want to clutter up all of your requirements documentation, whatever form you've kept that in, with extraneous information that doesn't really help people understand the needs and help devise the solution. So really, you've got to have a shared understanding of what these requirement things are that you have in your organization, or people are going to be working at cross purposes. Now, of course, another problem is that not everybody believes that requirements are important or necessary. And I remember a conversation that I had with a senior manager once when I had just become a manager at Kodak. This was a very, very long time ago. And I made a radical statement in a meeting with a bunch of senior managers in the Kodak research labs where I was working. I said, at this point forward, my group, my software group, will do no work without written requirements, written specifications. And there was this one manager who was kind of a whiny guy, and he said, well, I'm not sure your definition of specifications is the same as mine. So I said, well, then let's use mine. And then I explained what I meant by specifications, and he said, oh, okay. So his initial resistance to the idea of creating requirement specifications as being just unnecessary project overhead, as soon as I explained to him what I meant and why it was important, he said, oh, okay. So his resistance disappeared immediately. But I think it's very important that we do have this shared understanding, because otherwise you have these kinds of conflicts and confusions. So let me give you a definition here. There's no shortage of definitions of requirements in the software literature. Some of them are pretty good, and others I think are not terribly helpful. But here's the definition that I like the best. This came from Ian Somerville and Pete Sawyer. And they say requirements are a specification of what should be implemented. That is, we're trying to describe to someone what we're going to have when we're done. They are descriptions of how the system should behave. Those are the so-called functional requirements. And that's what people traditionally focus on. They're often written in the form of shall statements. The system shall do this, or the user shall be able to do that. Not everybody likes shall statements, but I don't care, because I think they're fine. But basically, the focus here is on the functionality. But requirements could also be descriptions of a system property or attribute. That is, some characteristic of the system that talks about not what it does, but rather how well it does the things that it does. And this is where things like quality attributes fit in. And that's a critical aspect of non-functional requirements. Also, this definition says that requirements may be a constraint on the development process of the system. And so I like this definition because it points out that there's a lot of kinds of information that go into this big bucket of stuff that we call the requirements. Now, the other thing that I learned long ago is that we have to think in terms of multiple levels of requirements. So I want to share with you briefly here a model that I find helpful. There's a saying about models. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. And that's certainly true here. This model is not all-inclusive, but I find it a helpful construct for thinking about different types of requirements information. So at the top level are what I call the business requirements. And when I describe business requirements, I'm talking about the kind of information that lets us know why we are undertaking the project. Okay? What's our business motivation? What objectives are we attempting to achieve and satisfy when we build this solution, whatever it happens to be? So that sets the stage for a lot of the decisions that you make on the rest of the project. And I like to store the business requirements in a vision and scope document, kind of a high-level guiding document. Now, you might use some other name for something like that. You might create a project charter or a marketing requirements document. That's fine. But some kind of a high-level place where we really get an understanding of what, from a business point of view, we're trying to accomplish with this system. So the solid lines in this model indicate that something is stored in something else. Now, I talk about these as documents, but they don't have to be traditional word processing documents. Just think of them as containers in which you store information in some organized fashion. But the business requirements are not enough information to let somebody know what to build, so we have to go down another level to the user requirements. So the dotted line here indicates something is the origin of another piece of information, or that the thing above it influences the thing below the dotted arrow. So here the user requirements talk about what the user can do with the system. Okay? So business requirements are kind of why information. User requirements are a kind of what information. What will users be able to accomplish? And we want to think in terms of creating some sort of user requirements document. That could be a set of use cases written in various levels of detail as appropriate. It could be a set of user stories written on cards or however you want to handle them. But these are all talking about things the user needs to be able to do. Now, a lot of people stop there, but they almost always run into problems then because there's simply not enough information. And so what I found is that we need to go down to one other level, which are the functional requirements. The functional requirements are another kind of what information. They describe what the developer builds into the software solution. Okay, so we have this alignment. You see those arrows roughly line up, and that is not an accident. We're going to get alignment so that we make sure that the functional requirements that we create and store in our software requirement specification or maybe in an RM tool, those functional requirements will enable users to perform the requirements they need to accomplish, and those will align with achieving our business objectives. Okay, so this lining up with the arrows is not an accident. All right, so that's kind of the functional leveling and flow, but we have other kinds of information as well that are part of our requirement set. One set is business rules. I put that at the top level because it does represent business kind of information, but business rules are not themselves requirements. They are often the source of requirements. Business rules might lead to deriving certain functionality to enforce or comply with a policy or a standard or a regulation, or they might influence who can do what with certain kinds of user requirements. Business rules sometimes also feed into quality attributes, which are a type of user requirement. Quality attributes are a type of non-functional requirement that talks about things like the usability of the system or its portability or its reliability, these kinds of quality characteristics. And we want to store those in our software requirement specification as well. We also have external interface requirements we have to deal with that talk about how your system connects to the rest of the universe, and also these design and implementation constraints that we have to be aware of. So I like this model because it does help me start thinking of classifying requirements information into various categories, which get stored in different places and come into view at different stages of our project, often from various sources. So these three containers, vision and scope type information, user requirements, and the software requirement specification, really are the repositories for the information that we're going to collect so that we know what to build. Now, not everybody thinks that requirements are important, and some people think that taking the time to explore requirements will slow the project down because it just delays the real work of coding. But studies have found that projects that spend a larger fraction of their time on requirements actually move faster than similar projects that spent less time on requirements. So here I'd like to show you some of the reasons why having good requirements can actually accelerate development. First of all, by establishing these business requirements at that top level, we now have a shared vision for the project stakeholders to work toward. We have a shared set of goals and expectations so that people are working in alignment instead of at cross purposes. One of the things we'll see as we go along is how important user involvement is, and that tends to reduce the chance of people not getting what they want and rejecting the system at the end of the project. And I'll say more about that a little bit later in the presentation. Having some clear and documented requirements helps you make sure that the functionality you build actually does let users perform their essential business tasks. It's very frustrating to build a piece of software and then have people say, well, yeah, but it doesn't let me do this that I have to do, and then you have to go fix it. So let's have requirements to understand ways to try to avoid that from the beginning. By talking about some of these non-functional requirements like quality attributes, we reach a shared understanding of quality expectations. It can be very expensive, sometimes almost impossible, to reverse engineer desired quality characteristics into a flawed system. If you've got serious performance problems or security problems, it's going to take a lot of work to fix those, so let's try to understand those kinds of needs up front. Sometimes people just say, well, let's get this software built and put it in front of users, and then we'll see what they say, and we'll fix it. Well, yeah, you can do that, and you're always going to do some of that, but if you can focus on requirements, that's a lot cheaper than beta testing, and it's a lot cheaper to fix problems that you find after thinking about them than after you've built a bunch of software. Now, notice I'm not suggesting here that you have to get all of your requirements right before you start building any software, the classic but flawed waterfall approach. Instead, I'm really thinking about the body of requirements knowledge that you accumulate over the course of the project. But it's still cheaper to think about requirements and to iterate on requirements than to fix things when people are telling you about all the problems. If we do a good job on requirements and how we manage requirements, then we can make sure that the right changes that come along are incorporated in an appropriate way. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go along as well. And another reason why requirements can really speed things up is that you can use reviews of requirements knowledge to find errors very early in the process instead of much later after they have done a bunch of damage that you have to then undo. All right, so the second critical success factor is, again, getting back to this idea of having clearly defined business requirements. I see we have a question here about business requirements as related to business objectives. So let's talk about some different kinds of things here. People typically do think in terms of requirements as describing the system's functionality, but we need to establish this foundation of business requirements in three major categories, although there's other kinds of things as well. Business objectives really come from an understanding of the business problems or market opportunities that led you to create a project in the first place. Companies don't come up with a project just because they can't think of anything else to do. They come up with a software project because they've got some need to improve their efficiency or create new products or increase revenue or whatever. So let's understand those business objectives, because all of the other decisions that we make on the project should be aligned towards achieving those business objectives. We should also have some key performance indicators, some metrics that we can use to help us assess whether we've achieved those business objectives and whether we're going to derive the desired value from the project or the product that we create. Another important part of the business requirements is the product vision. People sometimes talk about vision and scope. I agree with the idea of vision and scope, but I subdivide that slightly. I talk about a product vision and a project scope. So the product vision describes a concept of what the product might ultimately become, sort of your long-term target for what you're trying to build. Now, this is written at a high level. You don't have a lot of details in here, but you do try to get some broad strokes of the business benefits that the system's going to provide. And I like to use a very nice little keyword template that helps us get some understanding of just what we have in mind with our mental image of this product we're trying to create. So in our book, we describe this keyword template, and just by having those keywords, it helps you think through different aspects of why are you doing this? What are you hoping to end up with? And then we've got to differentiate the vision from the scope. The project scope, and we'll say more about scope as we go along here, really defines the boundary between what's in and what's out. Every project is only going to implement some defined subset of all possible functionality, and typically you end up implementing a product vision through a series of releases or iterations or versions of a system that moves toward that vision, and each of those has a defined scope. Each of those projects or iterations has a defined scope, so we know what are we doing in this section of work, what are we not doing in this section of work. And a good thing to include there is any known limitations or exclusions. People might be making assumptions about what's going to be included, and if we know that certain capabilities will not be included, at least not in a particular iteration or release, let's make a statement of that so nobody expects to see it there. So by defining scope, this helps us make sensible project commitments, resource allocations, helps us think about how to prioritize the infinitely large body of work we have to do. And a lot of people complain about project scope and scope creep. Well, how do you manage scope creep if you don't even know what the scope was supposed to be? How do you even know if you're experiencing scope creep if you never defined what the scope was supposed to be for a particular body of work? So scope is a foundation for not rejecting change, but rather accepting change in a way that minimizes the negative impact on the project. So all of the rest of the work you do in the project should somehow be aligned with achieving your business objectives. And unless you establish those business objectives at the outset, it's pretty hard to achieve that alignment. It's funny, everybody talks about scope. Lots of projects have to deal with scope creep, but I realized some years ago that there really is not a lot written about how to actually represent project scope. My second book on requirements was called More About Software Requirements, a clever title from the publisher. And one of the things I did there is included a chapter that describes several techniques for scope definition. So I'd like to quickly talk about some of those here because they are so central to defining the business requirements. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these, perhaps the venerable context diagram, which has been around for decades. And the context diagram shows you nothing about the interior of your system, nothing about the internals. It's just a circle with the name of your system in it and then some boxes outside that show those external entities that interface with your system and exchange flows of data or control signals or actually physical materials if you define your system to include manual operations as well. So the context diagram very clearly shows the scope boundary, what's in and what's out. The use case diagram is kind of similar to that, although now it's a box instead of a circle. And we do now have a little bit of visibility inside our system. So we've got that scope boundary shown in the box, but inside the system, inside the box, we have some use cases shown which at least identify the major things that users will be able to do. And then outside the system, similar to the context diagram's external entities, we show the actors outside the system that will interact with the system by performing or participating in certain use cases. So the use case diagram is another scoping technique. We can talk about features. Not every project does, but many projects do. And there's a couple of techniques that we can use there. In Joy Beatty's earlier book on visual models for software requirements, she talks about a technique called a feature tree, which is a nice way to visually show a hierarchy of major features then broken down into smaller features. And this is a way to start thinking about, okay, which subset of all of these possible features at various levels do we plan to package together for a particular release? That's a scope definition technique. So we can really think in terms of taking a feature and then having multiple levels of increasing enrichment or capability built into each feature, and then you choose which levels of each of those features you want to put into each release. And that set of those levels then constitutes a scope definition. So a term I use for this is a feature roadmap. And then a fourth technique for scope definition is to think about the various external events that your system has to detect and respond to. There's some kind of a trigger that stimulates a response from the system, so you often build an event response table or an event list. And at a high level, an event list will actually talk about the scope issues. What kind of events are we going to handle in this release? Which kind of events are we going to handle in some other release? And system events can be classified into three categories. They could be business events. The trigger event that launches a use case is often a kind of business event. We can have temporal or time-triggered events. These are things that happen either at a specific time, such as creating an external database feed at midnight every night for your system, or they could be things that happen after a certain time interval has passed. Or they can be signal events. And signal events are typical in combined hardware-software systems where we might have sensors that are sending in signals and say, okay, time to turn up the heat here because our bath is getting a little bit colder than we want it to be. So these kinds of events help us define the capabilities we plan to implement in a particular release. The third critical success factor I want to talk about is the role of the business analyst. We need trained, skilled, and motivated business analysts if we want to be successful. I'm guessing that quite a few of you are in the business analyst function, or you probably wouldn't be attending this webinar. Now, the role of the business analyst is always performed by someone on the project, whether it's an actual job title given to a BA specialist, or whether the activities are fragmented across multiple people who have other real jobs. So maybe in some projects a developer might do some BA work and maybe a project manager does some. So different people can do this, but somebody is always performing the function of understanding and communicating requirements. There's a lot of titles that organizations use for this. So even though the role of business analyst has gained a lot of visibility and respect as a profession over the last 8 or 10 years, not everybody calls these people business analysts. Sometimes people have a job title like requirements analyst or requirements engineer, requirements manager. Sometimes they're called systems analyst, and then I've seen all sorts of debates raging in discussion groups. So what's the difference between a business analyst and a systems analyst? And then there are some people who have business systems analysts, BSAs. And a lot of times there isn't any difference between what those people do. They're just different terms. But in some places, yeah, there is a difference. So there is no universal set of definitions here. So we can just call them an analyst and let it go at that. So the BA performs a very busy bridging function. I like to think of the BA as choreographing the collaboration of multiple project stakeholders. So the BA might work with a project sponsor, the guy with the checkbook, to understand the business objectives and other business requirements. They often spend a lot of time working with suitable user representatives to define the user requirements, and that's where things like use cases and user stories become valuable. There's a whole set of other stakeholders they may end up working with to understand various expectations and constraints. I'm going to say more about stakeholders as we go along. I'm sorry to keep giving you these forward references to topics that I'll talk about later. I've been giving presentations for many years, and I've never yet learned how to say everything at the same time, so we will get to these various topics. The BA often works very closely with the project manager. The project manager needs to know something about how big the project is and how complex is it, because they have to make resource allocations and plans and commitments. And in fact, there's been a lot of discussion in the literature in recent years about the juxtaposition of the project manager and BA roles. There's a little bit of overlap, certainly, in the kind of skill set and things they do, but I think these are two different roles that could be performed by the same person if that person has the right skill set and interest and knowledge, but they're different jobs. Okay, both of them are important to project success, and usually both of them consume quite a bit of time. So it's asking a lot to expect one person to do both of those things on anything but a very small project. The BA takes a lot of this information and communicates it to developers, who then need to know about the functional and non-functional requirements they're expected to satisfy, and testing also needs to know about that so they can figure out how to determine if it was satisfied correctly. So the BA really has a very important central role here. Let's talk a little bit about their functions and tasks and skills that they need. Really, it's the centerpiece of all this is communication. The BA has to be able to communicate effectively with users to understand the application domain, understand their needs, and then structure that into a set of requirements that are a little more technical that can be communicated clearly to developers. So the BA has to have credibility with both of these communities as part of that bridging function. And this process of translating user requirements into technical requirements is a very fundamental part of the job. So you may not do all of these things, but there's a lot of project tasks that BAs might get involved with. They may probably not define the business requirements by themselves, but they very well might work with a project sponsor or product visionary to be able to help them craft a set of business objectives and a vision and scope. Often they'll help identify the project stakeholders, a subset of which is user classes, so we know who to talk to elicit the requirements of various kinds. We analyze those requirements to decompose them into appropriate levels of detail, to understand their relative priority. Maybe we draw some pictures to represent information in different ways and so forth. And then we craft some body of collected information which can be communicated to all of the other stakeholders so they know what to do in terms of their part of the construction and validation of the system, and in terms of actually knowing what to expect will be delivered. The BA may be involved in leading a requirements validation input, a set of activities to try to confirm that the requirements we've accumulated will in fact do a good job of meeting our business needs. Very important is to get involved with the requirements prioritization. Now, this doesn't mean the BA makes all those decisions. It means they facilitate the process of having various people contribute to reaching agreement on what sequence we need to build things in. And then once you have a set of requirements in hand, actually requirements management sort of begins as soon as you have a requirement in hand, because you have to start dealing with changes. So we need to track the status of requirements as they go from concepts into ultimately delivered software. We need to trace things together so we know what requirements were satisfied by what code and so forth. So the BA often gets involved in a wide variety of activities. So in order to do that, there's a lot of skills that they need. And I'm just going to quickly go through this list. These are all things that a good BA needs to have a fair amount of proficiency at. Now, don't be discouraged if you aren't good at all these things yet, because there's always opportunities to learn more. You need listening skills. Sometimes you need to read between the lines to hear what people aren't saying, but maybe need to say, and then to be able to kind of coax that information out of them. A lot of time BAs spend is with working with users in interviews and asking questions and recording the information in a useful fashion. You need good analytical skills to get below the surface of what's presented and really understand the underlying need. One of the biggest problems I hear people complain about is that, oh, our customers don't give us requirements, they give us solutions. Okay, well, since that happens, then the BA needs to be able to recognize when they've been presented with a solution and then figure out, all right, so if that was the answer, what was the question? What's the real requirement? Communication, again, I want to reiterate how important that is. This is a central sort of thing, and BAs need to be able to get people who sometimes have conflicting interests and maybe don't even fully trust each other to work together. So you need good interpersonal skills. You need to be able to think at multiple levels of abstraction. This is important. You know, I think there are people around who are very good at high-level strategic visionary thinking, but maybe they don't really execute details real well. There are other people who are very, very good at execution. They're real detail-oriented, but they don't necessarily see the big picture. But I think a BA needs to be able to do both of those. They need to be able to know when do you drill down into details, when do you need to step back and to a higher level of abstraction and get the bigger picture, and when do you get into the forest or the trees or the leaves on the trees. So to be able to look at a system and slide readily back and forth on that abstraction scale is real important. You need to be able to facilitate discussions and workshops with people. There's some leadership here. You know, you're not just a scribe. You're actually leading a group of people towards a solution that's going to reach the best possible cumulative business outcome, and sometimes that means not everybody gets just what they want. Sometimes we elicit by observing people in the workplace. You need to be able to write clearly. Again, another form of communication, both input and output. Every BA needs a rich set of capabilities to be able to draw models, visual diagrams that show information at different levels of abstraction for different audiences, the ability to say, oh, this kind of problem would best be represented with a decision table, or this kind of problem would best be analyzed using a data model. So you should have a whole toolkit of modeling techniques available. Dealing with this quantity of information means you need to be really well organized and never underestimate the importance of creativity. You're not just writing down what people say, you're making suggestions and asking questions. You might ask during an elicitation session, well, would anybody ever need to do something? And some people might say, oh, that's fantastic. I didn't even know you could do that. Thank you. That will be a big help. So a lot of things you need to do here. Now, since I'm assuming that a lot of you in the audience do perform this BA function in some capacity, I recognize BAs come from a variety of backgrounds. They might be former users, maybe former developers. They could be subject matter experts, a former or current project manager, or maybe you're just a rookie, just kind of starting out in the IT business. So you're going to need to identify gaps in your knowledge, your skill set, your experience, and try to close those through training or mentoring or some other approach. If you go to my website, processimpact.com, and then there's a button there called Goodies. And if you go to the Goodies page, you can get a sample business analyst job description, which might be helpful if this is something that you're getting started on. All right, another critical success factor is the idea of building a collaborative partnership with customers. That's a phrase I'll use a lot when talking about requirements, collaborative partnership. So let's talk a little bit about stakeholders. A stakeholder is an individual, a group, or an organization that is actively involved in a project, is affected by the process or the outcome of the project, or can influence the project's process or outcome. Consultant Tim Lister defines project success as meeting the set of all requirements and constraints that are held as expectations by key project stakeholders. So it's real important to do a stakeholder analysis early in your project. In the 3rd edition of my software requirements book, we have an extensive list of possible stakeholders who could either be within the project team itself, or they could be outside the project team but within the developing organization, or they could be outside the developing organization. You can find stakeholders in lots of places. So it's a good idea to cast a wide net to try to identify as many potential stakeholders as you can to make sure that the important needs are identified and addressed. We can subdivide the domain of stakeholders for the purposes right here into 2 categories. We'll talk about customers and then other stakeholders, which we're not going to discuss further right now. We can further divide customers into users and other kinds of customers. The other customers might include the people who provide specifications but don't use the system themselves. They might procure it or fund it. Okay, so these are all customers, but the ones we want to talk about right now are the users. Direct users actually use the system hands-on. Indirect users maybe are a step removed. Maybe they get the outputs or provide the inputs, but they don't touch the system themselves. And we can further divide them into several user classes on every project, some of whom are favored and get more of what they want, some of whom are disfavored that we want to keep out, like people who might need to might try to steal your credit card information or something. Other user classes we recognize exist, but we don't really pay much attention to them. They're going to get what they're going to get, and then there might be others as well. So it's important to do a user class analysis, a stakeholder analysis, so that you can identify who your customers are and really work on getting them involved. Now, my very first book was called Creating a Software Engineering Culture, and it's based on a bunch of principles that I think are important to having a group of people work together to build high-quality software. And one of those principles that I learned a long time ago is that customer involvement is the most critical factor in software quality. Let me show you how that works. Suppose we could make a plot where time moves from left to right and the y-axis can be whatever we want it to be. But what happens very often is that what the customer needs moves and changes in some direction over the course of the project, and what the developer builds might move in some different direction. And if we do not control that in some fashion, at the end of the project we end up with an expectation gap, a surprise, where people did not get what they expected to get. And my experience has been that software surprises are never good news, so I like to try to avoid them. I can give you a sad example of how this happened once. I was at a company teaching a class, and they told me a very sad story about how their internal IT development team had created a new system with negligible customer involvement. They were pretty sure they knew what the customers needed, and they were trying to work in good faith. They weren't just being jerks. And so they revealed the new system, delivered that, and the customers took a look at it and rejected it immediately as being completely unacceptable. Now, the day you proudly unveil your new baby to the world, you do not want to be told your baby is ugly, but that's exactly what happened. So what did they do? They fixed it. It's one of the great mysteries of software to me how we never feel like we have time to do things right. We never have time to talk to the people we need to and review our requirements and all that. And yet we almost always seem to find the time, the money, and the people to fix it. So that's what they did, and nobody was very happy about that. So we'd like to try to get customer involvement going on very early and continuously throughout the project, because that is so critical to making sure that we stay on track and have a very small expectation gap, if any, at the end. So that's why I consider this a critical success factor. So here are some suggestions for building that collaborative partnership. First, let's identify stakeholders using the kind of thought process I showed a couple of slides ago. That'll lead us to an understanding of who our user classes are. And there's probably more than you think, but maybe not as many as you're afraid of. And once we've identified who those user classes are, you have to think about who will be the literal voice of the customer for each user class. Who do you talk to understand their needs? And we developed, when I was at Kodak, and this was almost 30 years ago now, we developed this technique of product champions to be representatives of each user class to work with our software team to represent those needs. And that was tremendously helpful for us. It was a key success factor in our projects. If you can, try to get your business analysts, your developers, your customer representatives working pretty close together and physically located if possible. Although that's not a guarantee of success, I had a friend project manager once who said, yeah, we had a project champion. He sat in our midst and still managed to avoid us all. So that wasn't really what they were hoping to accomplish. So let's talk about how we're going to work together. My experience has been that people very often who are collaborating on something don't really talk about how are we going to work together, and then we have problems. One way we're going to reach that understanding is by discussing the rights and responsibilities that customers have when it comes to the requirements process. And Chapter 2 of our book talks a lot about those rights and responsibilities. Just a few words about this role of the product champion. Really, they serve as the primary interface between the development and customer communities. And ideally, these are real users, not managers of the real users or the funding sponsor who's providing requirements, not requirements, or imagining what users might want. And an important role of the product champion is to reconcile conflicting requirements that can come from different user groups. So the goal is to present the developers with a unified set of requirements with the help of the BA to pull this information together from the various product champions. So the product champions really have to have the authority to make decisions about user requirements, and we found it very helpful to actually document our product champion responsibilities so that people knew what they were getting in for when they signed up for that. The fifth critical success factor is rigorous and ongoing requirements prioritization. I had a friend once who told me that the last phase of every software development project, no matter what life cycle you were following, is the rapid de-scoping phase. And I just love that phrase. We get a mental image of throwing things overboard to try to get the boat into shore on time before it sinks. And at that point, you're making priority decisions. But instead, we should be doing that in an ongoing, continuous way. The sad fact is that not everything can be top priority. And so by considering our priorities, by balancing value versus cost, we can make sure we work on the right things first to deliver as much value as quickly as we can. We can make good trade-off decisions when we have these various competing requirements and demands for our time. And we can deal with new requirements or changes that come along by slotting them into their priority sequence and dealing with them in the right time. Unfortunately, this tends to become a very politically and emotionally charged activity sometimes. But if we can make it a little more analytical, a little more structured and thoughtful, then that's helpful. So it's helpful to think about what makes it desirable to implement one requirement versus another. And that's really how much customer value it's going to deliver. And customer value has two components. The benefit the customers would get if you included that, balanced against the penalty that they might experience if you did not include it. But then we have to balance that customer value perspective against what makes it less desirable to do one requirement versus another. And that boils down to the relative cost of implementing each one and the technical risk associated with it. Do we think we can do this? Now, our book describes several prioritization techniques, and one of the simplest is a 3-level scale. If you're using a 3-level scale, then no matter what words you give the levels, they boil down to high, medium, and low. I was at a company once where they said, well, it's not okay around here to say that a requirement is low priority. So our categories are high, super high, and incredibly high, which still boils down to high, medium, and low. The problem comes because most people don't precisely define what it means for a requirement to be high priority, medium priority, or low priority. So the way I think about this is in terms of which requirements are more urgent than others and which ones are more important than others. Let me show you what I mean. Now, I think we need to try to make our agreements on priorities as simple as possible. So I find this actually works pretty well. We can think about requirements that are important or not so important, urgent or not so urgent. And this is adapted from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People in terms of his habit that says put first things first. Now, if a requirement is important, that means the customers must have it. And if it's urgent, that means it must be included in the next release. And to me, that is what high priority means. If you've got a requirement that could wait till a later release and still be consistent with your business objectives, it is not high priority. A requirement that's high priority must be included in the next release or next iteration. So you take a pretty hard line on that. Now, something that's medium priority must be included, if that is, it's important, but it can wait, if necessary, for a later release. It's not so urgent. That's medium priority. Low priority requirements are those that are not terribly important and not very urgent, which means that it would be nice to have if we can work it in, but we'll live without it, perhaps forever. You'll see that there's a fourth quadrant here, and that's things that appear urgent, and yet they really aren't important. And by important, I mean aligned with achieving your business objectives. And so I suggest that we don't work on those. I give you this little warning symbol to indicate that that's a danger zone, because you can end up putting resources into working on those really without needing to. It doesn't do you any good. So let's try to avoid that. All right, getting near the end here, our sixth factor is to take an incremental and iterative approach to requirements development. The fact is, you cannot get all the requirements right up front. I suppose maybe there are times when you could, but it's certainly not realistic to plan on that. So I like to think in terms of layers. I like to start at a high level of abstraction and kind of work my way down, and that's where this business requirements, user requirements, functional requirements hierarchy came into place. So maybe you do this and you come up with a set of user requirements, maybe a bunch of user stories or a bunch of use cases. So I like to learn just enough about those, okay, not a full detail, but just enough about them so I can do a first cut of elicitation and then prioritization, and so I can start allocating those into sooner or later sort of things. Then you can take the top priority requirements that are allocated for the next release or iteration and flesh those out into further detail. But even if you do that, expect to come back to revisit the requirements, to refine them, to add more information, to modify them when necessary. So it is an incremental and iterative approach. But the key phrase that I keep in mind is progressive refinement of details. Don't just take the first use case you think of and then try to detail it to the nth degree, because maybe you're not even going to do that right away. Let's plan on going down in layers and try to detail the requirements sort of just in time, but first learn enough about them so that you can prioritize them sensibly. Some people talk about this whole domain of requirements stuff as requirements management. Some call it requirements engineering. I think of it all as requirements engineering, perhaps a bit optimistically. And I subdivide requirements engineering into requirements development and requirements management. Requirements development really covers all the things that you do to get good requirements, and then requirements management deals with how do you handle them once you have them. So there are 4 subcomponents of requirements development. Elicitation involves all the things you do to try to collect information. I don't like to talk about gathering requirements because it's not just a collection process. There's discovery and invention involved as well. And then we do some analysis to decompose those into further details, represent the information in appropriate ways. And during the analysis, you might find you have to go back and do some more elicitation to clarify some of those requirements. We take what we've learned and we specify that in a way that can be communicated to all those who need to know. And when you do that, you might find there's some thinking you have to go through some more to close some gaps in your knowledge. We need to validate that those requirements will, in fact, achieve our business objectives. And if they can't, then you may find during validation, for example, that there are ambiguities. You try to write some tests and you aren't sure what's supposed to happen, so we have to go clarify our requirements. And then we might find there's some feedback loops here that can take place all along the way. So this is consistent with the idea of requirements development being iterative and incremental. Finally, we want to make sure that we can anticipate and accommodate change. And this is one of my cosmic truths, is that change happens, whether you like it or not. So in that case, we need to anticipate the reality of change and the reality of requirements growing. So we need to understand our users, what their business goals and business drivers are, and think about where might changes be coming from. This will be helpful to anticipate what parts of the system you might want to expect change to take place in, whether you like it or not. So once we've anticipated it, we need to put into place structures to enable us to accommodate that reality of change. Think about your team's ability to adapt to change. I've heard stories and encountered organizations where people just didn't want to change. They wanted to freeze requirements, and that was what you're going to get. But that doesn't always work real well. We want to sometimes structure applications to facilitate rapid change, particularly those parts of the systems that we know are going to evolve over time. And so one of the ways you do that is think carefully about maintainability as an internal quality attribute for the way you design the software. And finally, we need to have mechanisms in place to manage change. It's great to have a tool to help you collect change requests and track those, but a tool is not a substitute for a process. So put in place a process so people know how change requests come in, what information they must contain, who they go to, how decisions or how their impact is assessed, how decisions are made and communicated, and so forth. Very important to evaluate the impact of a change before you say, sure, no problem, we can do that. So let's make sure you build that in. All right, some strategies here to help you manage change. In terms of requirements development, let's look for best practices for elicitation and customer engagement. Very often you have a lot of changing or new requirements coming along because we didn't do a very good job of elicitation and talking to the right people or asking the right questions. Let's define project scope as the reference so that you can take a change request and say, gee, does this belong in here or does it not? Let's define requirements baselines, a set of requirements that are allocated for a particular body of work that once allocated, you really don't plan on changing that very much unless there's a darn good reason, at least for that chunk of work. Your change control system should include the process you're going to follow and decisions about who's going to resolve change requests, who's going to make the decision to approve or reject those. And this is a group of people typically called a change control board. But as we go along here, make sure that the changes you accept are aligned with achieving your business objectives. That's why those business requirements are so important. And the way you approach your project management also has an impact on how you handle changes. Choose an appropriate development life cycle. If you're expecting a lot of change with very uncertain requirements for some good business reason, then take something very incremental and iterative, like an agile approach. If it's possible to get a better understanding of requirements early on and you don't expect them to be flamingly volatile, then you can take a more sequential approach. It's a good idea to build in contingency buffers to your project plans to accommodate the reality of requirements growth. Otherwise, if you don't plan for the growth and you make estimates and commitments just based on what you know at that moment, then the very first requirement change or the very first new feature that comes along will trash your plans and make it impossible for you to meet your commitments. Formal risk management is one of the most effective things you can do as part of your project management approach to try to see problems coming and head them off before they bite you. All right, so what can you do next? Well, first of all, go to your organization and assess points of pain. Where do you have things related to requirements that are not working as well as you'd like them to? So if you understand those, then you can say, let's figure out what the root causes are. Why are we having these problems? And that then gives you something actionable. Don't just treat symptoms. Treat underlying root causes. Choose effective practices to address the pain. That's really the centerpiece of our new software requirements book, as well as the second edition of the book, is a set of good practices drawn from a lot of industry experience, including a lot of my and Joy's personal experiences, but also look around you for what works well in your organization. What have other people done on other projects, and try to leverage that as much as you can. Develop a set of procedures that are helpful for people so they don't all have to reinvent how they're going to approach requirements project to project. Have some standard templates and work aids and checklists and spreadsheet tools and things. We provide a lot of those in our process goodies so that you've got a big jump start on doing better work tomorrow than you did yesterday. It's not realistic to expect people to work in better ways unless they've been trained in how to do this. So make sure we've got a good understanding of how to handle requirements issues on our projects. And be open about this. Share what you've learned with others. Be willing to learn from people around you. Don't just work heads down. Let's try to all climb small learning curves by helping each other along. And surround everything you do with communication, because software is maybe 50% computing and 50% communication. Actually, it's probably a lot more than 50% communication. And requirements is entirely about communication. So thank you for joining me today and Franklin and the other folks involved with ModernAnalyst.com. The reason that I think it's important to understand these kinds of critical success factors is to avoid those unpleasant surprises that happen so much at the end of software projects. So now I'll pass the presentation back to Franklin Carr of iRise, who has some closing comments and will facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks, Carl. That was a great presentation. As always, I learned a ton. So I just want to point out to everyone that using those 7 critical success factors that Carl just went through and pairing it with a visualization tool like iRise will really, really help you avoid any of those nasty surprises on your projects. I invite you to explore iRise.com and download this month's featured white paper, which is building a business case for visualization. And also, if you'd like to see iRise in action, we are hosting a webinar on June 27th showing iRise a day in the life and utilizing it in your SDLC. If you haven't already submitted your questions, please use the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'm going to open up those questions now. We'll start moving with Carl for the remainder of the time. So, Carl, I think one of the first questions that actually came up was from Vishal, and they would like to know how different types of requirements map to user concepts in Agile.
To user stories?
Yes, user stories.
Okay. Well, I think user stories are really at the user requirements level. Okay, a user story typically represents a single user requirement because it describes something a user needs to be able to do with the system to achieve a particular outcome of value. So in that sense, a user story is really equivalent to a use case. They are represented in different levels of detail, but the concept is exactly the same idea. Now, some user stories might be written as detailed as functional requirements, and that's not so good because then you can end up with a big pile of very granular user stories that just represent little fragments of functionality, and you have no structured context in which to assemble those and understand them. Some people will write non-functional requirements in the form of stories in terms of like a performance goal or something like that. So they definitely relate, but I think it's important to recognize that there are different kinds of requirements information that are not going to be captured in the form of a simple user story. So if you're taking an Agile requirements approach and you're just doing user stories, then you're probably missing some of this other kind of very important information.
Okay. So Hannah has a multi-part question. We'll start with the first part that she says, their requirements are so detailed that they actually can serve as a test plan for the QA group. As developers, the level of detail is slowing us down. We can't see the forest through the trees. So how could we initiate a change, have the right level of details in our SRS documents, and have the QA group create their own test plan?
Well, I'd say the first thing to do is to talk to each other. Okay, that collaborative approach that I've stressed in the presentation certainly applies to the way the different stakeholders talk to each other about what they need. You know, very often we create a deliverable on a project, let's say a requirement specification, but it could be anything else, anything that has to be used by other people. We create that from the point of view of the author. Okay, the author, maybe the business analyst, says, well, here's what I think ought to go into a requirement specification, and here's how much detail I think it ought to have, and here's how I think it ought to be organized, and then you throw it over the wall and it lands on the head of a developer or a tester who says, once again, here comes something that's not organized in a way that works for me, that has either nowhere near enough detail or way too much detail, like in this particular case. And so instead of just griping about it, let's sit down with people and say, here's what I need from you for me to do my job effectively. In other words, let's learn how to write these critical bridging documents from the point of view of the consumer of the information, not the point of view of the author of the information. So I would start with that kind of conversation. And very often what this means is that one type of requirements information or documentation is not going to be sufficient to meet the needs of all stakeholder groups. So that's sort of about the best advice I can give without seeing something more specific. I don't like to give real precise advice based on tiny, tiny bits of knowledge about the situation. But I would really emphasize collaborating with the other people involved and talking about how to communicate within the project most effectively rather than just everybody doing what they think they ought to do and then inflicting it on everybody else.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. And Mark would like to know, how do you engage the stakeholders from the very beginning, especially when dealing with cross-silo stakeholders? In some cases, they feel that your product is not important to them, and then halfway through the process, they realize the value, and a light goes on. How can we turn that light on sooner?
Well, it's all about communication, right? And it's about understanding the business objectives for the project. If you don't have a clear understanding of business objectives, or if those aren't, maybe somebody has a clear understanding, but maybe that's not well documented and well communicated to others who don't see the relevance to them, then later on when they do get that information, then all of a sudden you say, hey, wait, this is important. I am a stakeholder. I need some input because this affects me. So I guess what I would do in this case, I would ask myself, what led the light to go on later? In other words, if people didn't see the relevance early on and then later on they said, oh, wait, this is important to me, how did they learn that? What piece of information or what kind of exchange of information taught them that? Then try to figure out, is there a way that we could have maybe communicated that earlier? And it very well might be a matter of, A, understanding the business objectives and documenting those in a shared form, and that's why I like to use my vision and scope document template. These templates, incidentally, I described are all available at processimpact.com on the goodies page. So I think that would help. And the other thing we can do is try to cast a wide net for stakeholders. And maybe look at your company organization chart and think about who might be affected from an organization chart point of view, and then talk to those people early on with that business objectives information in hand so that they have an opportunity to see the relevance and provide any input that's necessary to have it meet their needs.
Thank you, Carl and Franklin, for a very informative presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's event, and we hope you have a great day. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everybody.